New Mexico Territory, 1883. The scorching sun seared the desert plains, heat dancing across the parched earth in shimmering waves. At the edge of the frontier, Johanna Russell lived alone on a small homestead she'd nurtured from dust and determination. One sweltering afternoon, she found a wounded Apache warrior collapsed near her well. Fear flared in her heart, yet compassion overtook caution. With trembling hands, she poured cool water between his cracked lips. She could never have imagined that this single act of mercy would unleash a powder keg of tension by morning. The entire horizon bristled with Apache warriors surrounding her humble home. Johanna Russell had come to this sun-baked corner of the New Mexico Territory 2 years before, after losing her husband, Robert, to a fever that swept through St. Louis. Life in the East had become a daily reminder of what she'd lost. Faces, sights, and every street corner sparked the memory of what once was. So she sold what little she had left and boarded a stagecoach west, a single trunk of belongings slung at her feet. She heard rumors of cheap land near the newly expanding territories, rumors that the desert with enough grit could be made to bloom. That journey led Johanna to a swath of land near the Rio Bonito, a winding tributary that kept a fragile promise of life. Only a few ranchers and prospectors staked their claim out here, and the U.S. cavalry patrolled from Fort Bowie, a real name Johanna had heard countless times on her journey. The fort, built many years before, was famous for its role in the ongoing skirmishes with the Apache people who called this place home, surrounded by thorny mesquite and towering saguaro. Johanna's homestead was perched where the desert met the rocky foothills, providing her enough high ground to see incoming visitors, but also making her a lone target. Yet she persevered. Each day she fed her chickens, milked her solitary goat, and tended a half-acre patch of corn and beans, coaxing life out of inhospitable soil. She built a small cabin with the help of a traveling carpenter who passed by. Life was lean but manageable. There were days Johanna swore the desert would swallow her whole, and days it rewarded her with breathtaking sunsets that illuminated the sky in flaming oranges and pinks. The land was tough, but so was she. Her father had always said that a strong back and stronger resolve could plant seeds in any soil and watch them grow. All the while, the tension between settlers and the indigenous tribes simmered just out of sight. Hardly a month went by without news of a raid, an ambush, or a cavalry strike. The locals whispered rumors of Geronimo lurking in the mountains of desperate last stands, and of settlement after settlement gone up in flames. Johanna listened, offered brief prayers for peace, then continued minding her farm. She believed in kindness to strangers, in bridging differences, and in focusing on her own tasks, until the day destiny landed a wounded Apache warrior on her doorstep. Johanna first noticed him as she unlatched her barn door that blazing afternoon. A faint shape stumbled across the horizon, sliding through the desert as if pursued by ghosts. Her heart leapt, uncertain whether she should hide or offer assistance. She kept a battered rifle in her cabin, but it was hardly loaded. She had only 3 rounds left. Before she could muster the courage to run for it, the stranger collapsed near the corner of her property, right beside the well. Her throat went dry with fear. In the hush of midday heat, everything seemed amplified, the hammering of her heart, the shuffle of the man's body, and the hush of the desert wind. Setting down the milk pail, she approached warily. The man was young, maybe in his early 20s. He wore a shirt of faded buckskin and had a bandage wrapped haphazardly around his torso, blood seeping through. From the style of his moccasins and the beadwork on his belt, Johanna guessed he was Apache, one of the very people the cavalry had warned settlers about. She hesitated, grappling with swirling thoughts. This man could be an enemy, or he might be an innocent who needed aid. Johanna was not a soldier or a lawman. She was simply a homesteader, trying to live off the land. Still, the sight of his broken state, sun-cracked lips, and shallow breathing overwhelmed any thoughts of violence. Kneeling beside him, she touched her fingers to his burning forehead. He was delirious, half-conscious. If she did nothing, he'd die within the hour in this heat. Impulsively, she dashed to the well and lowered the bucket muscles, straining against the heavy chain. Water sloshed up in a small gush, and she dipped her canteen, carrying it over. She tilted his head gently, letting cool water slip past his lips. The man coughed, sputtered, and then moaned in relief. Gathering her courage, Johanna whispered words of comfort he might not even understand. To her surprise, he opened his eyes. They looked at each other for one charged moment, her bright blue eyes wide with concern, his dark eyes glazed with pain. The trust between them was fragile, built on nothing but a single act of compassion. When he tried to speak, his voice came out in a raspy whisper. She pressed a finger to her lips, urging him to rest. Johanna glanced around, heart hammering. She knew the risk. If the Apache found out she had taken one of their own under her roof, would they see it as an act of kindness or meddling? If the U.S. cavalry stumbled upon her giving aid to an Apache warrior, would they accuse her of conspiracy? There were no easy answers. But a man's life hung in the balance, and Johanna would not watch him die. With considerable effort, Johanna half-carried, half-dragged the wounded warrior into her cabin. She laid him down on her cot, wincing at the sight of his bloody bandage. Though her hands trembled, she fetched a clean cloth and warm water, recalling the medical lessons she'd learned helping her mother nurse her father through rheumatic fevers back in Missouri. Slowly, she unwrapped the soaked bandage and discovered a bullet graze along his ribs. The wound looked infected, red lines snaked outward, proof of brewing sickness. She cleaned the gash carefully, biting her lip each time he hissed in pain. The water in the basin turned crimson as she dabbed. Soon, the man drifted into a feverish sleep. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. Outside, the day's heat still pressed upon the land, but inside Johanna's cabin, a different tension flared. She was tending to a wounded Apache, with no idea how he'd come to be here or how dangerous he might be once recovered. Night fell quickly. Johanna lit a lantern, the weak glow dancing across the cabin walls. She checked on the man's wound again and debated whether to give him more water. Finally, she decided it was safer than risking dehydration. His eyes opened, briefly, caught the lantern light, and he seemed to mouth a word, though she couldn't catch it. She whispered, rest hoping somehow he understood. She smoothed back his hair, as she might have done for a feverish child. Outside, coyotes yipped at the rising moon. Johanna felt her own exhaustion pulling her under. She perched on a wooden stool across from the cot rifle, leaning at her side, just in case. Her eyelids fluttered. She fought to stay awake, but the day's labor and the swirl of emotions eventually won out. She drifted off, head lolling against the wall. Sometime in the middle of the night, she started awake. For a second, she forgot everything where she was, why she held the rifle so tightly. Then she remembered the wounded Apache. He lay motionless, shallow breaths rising and falling. She sighed, relieved he hadn't died in the night. Yet outside the thin walls of her cabin, the desert seemed to hold its breath. There was no wind, no chorus of insects, nothing but stillness that pressed like an omen on Johanna's mind. She rose to fetch another damp cloth and felt a chill creep up her spine. She peered through a crack in the shutter. Moonlight illuminated her property in silver. There was no movement, no sign of intruders, but the sense of being watched, of crossing a line she couldn't uncross, gnawed at her. Drawing the shutters tight, Johanna tended the wounded man once more. If there were watchers out there, let them see her compassion. She would not hide. Johanna awoke to the faint glow of dawn seeping through the shutters. The Apache warrior still slept, though his fever seemed lower, his breathing less labored. A quick peek under the bandage showed the infection was no worse a small victory. She cracked open her door to let in a cooler morning breeze. The desert beyond was still hush, the horizon painted soft pink and orange. A routine day, she tried to tell herself as she went to gather eggs from her hens. A routine day, despite the stranger in her bed. She stepped into the yard, breathing in the fresh desert air. The hens clucked lazily around her ankles. For a moment, the scene was almost peaceful. Then she spotted them silhouettes on the horizon, too many to count at first glance. They stood in a semicircle, unmoving, a cluster of Apache warriors. Johanna's heart lurched. She counted at least 15 or 20, perhaps more, hidden behind the scattered boulders. They wore streaks of paint, some armed with lances or rifles. Their horses pawed the ground restlessly. Not one moved toward her. Her first impulse was panic. She fled inside, heart pounding so loud she could barely hear her own thoughts. She rushed to the cot where the injured man stared back at her with wide eyes now fully awake. The fear on his face was evident. He too had heard or sensed that his kin had come. Johanna wasn't sure if he was relieved or anxious. "They're here," she murmured, voice trembling. The young warrior tried to rise, grimacing in pain. She placed a hand on his shoulder, urging him to stay put. She didn't know the Apache language, but she spoke with her eyes. "Stay still. Let me handle this." She wasn't sure what else to do. Her only plan was to walk outside unarmed, show her empty hands, and hope they understood she meant no harm. A wave of dread threatened to overcome her. She forced it down, squared her shoulders, and took a slow step onto the porch. The sun had crested the horizon, bathing the desert in stark clarity. The warriors were closer than before, forming a menacing ring around her homestead. Johanna's knees threatened to give out. She was but one woman armed with compassion and a nearly empty rifle. Would they see her deed as an act of war, of kidnapping, or an act of mercy? One of the warriors in front, a tall man with silver strands in his hair, raised his rifle in a gesture that halted Johanna's breath. But then he spun it around, muzzle to the sky, using it more like a staff than a weapon. He took a few steps forward. Beneath his stern gaze, Johanna raised her hands, showing she held nothing. The man's face was dark, creased from years in the desert sun, and his eyes glinted with steel. She swallowed hard. "He's hurt," she said, gesturing to the cabin, unsure if any of them understood English. "I gave him water." She pointed to the well. "He was going to die." Her words sounded pitiful, fragile in the face of so many armed men. Behind the leader, an older man barked something in Apache. Johanna flinched, uncertain if it was anger or caution. The tall leader stared, measured, and then motioned her aside with a curt nod. Two other warriors dismounted and marched forward, rifles at the ready. Fear shot through Johanna. She scrambled off the porch, giving them a clear path. They entered the cabin, disappearing within. For a minute everything was frozen. Johanna could hardly breathe, watching the door, as if it were the threshold between life and death. Then the men emerged, carrying the wounded warrior between them. His arm was draped around one's shoulder, and he was wincing in pain. The leader spoke quietly to him in Apache. The younger man nodded, gesturing to Johanna. Something flickered across the older warrior's face. Was it relief? Doubt? Then the leader inclined his head to Johanna, the barest gesture of respect. Without another word, the warriors guided their injured comrade to a horse, helping him mount. Johanna stifled a gasp, worried about reopening his wounds, but it was not her place to intervene. She stood there, trembling in the dusty yard, as the group coalesced around the wounded man. For a terrifying heartbeat, she thought they might seize her, drag her away, for reasons unknown. But they simply circled her property, some turning to glare at her, as if deciding her fate, some glancing at the well she had used to save one of their own. Finally, the leader raised his hand in a signal. The war party turned and rode off, hooves kicking up a swirl of dust. Within moments, they were a speck on the horizon, vanishing into the desert haze. Johanna remained on her porch knees, weak emotions raw. They had surrounded her, come close enough to kill her if they wished, but they had not. She exhaled in relief, uncertain whether she had just made friends or enemies. Word traveled fast in the frontier. Though Johanna lived in relative isolation, a handful of local ranchers, prospectors, and travelers made up her loose-knit community. They dropped by each other's homesteads from time to time, sharing gossip and supplies. One such neighbor was Manny Alvarez, who kept a small horse ranch 15 miles north. He rode over a few days later, dust caking his boots, worry etched across his face. "Miss Russell," he called from a distance, tipping his hat. "Mind if I water my horse?" His posture was tense, as though expecting trouble. Johanna waved him forward. As Manny led his mare to the trough, he asked in a hushed tone, "Heard a rumor. Some folks say a bunch of Apaches were seen near your place. Everything all right?" Johanna stiffened. How had news spread so quickly? She pressed her lips thin and decided half-truths might be safest. "They passed by," she said. "Didn't trouble me." They were looking for one of their own who got hurt. Manny shook his head, spitting into the dirt. "Everyone's on edge these days. You must be braver than most living out here alone. You sure you're okay?" He glanced around as if expecting to see signs of a skirmish. The weight of the encounter still pressed on Johanna's nerves. "I'm fine," she assured, offering a weak smile. She couldn't read Manny's expression. Was it pity or suspicion? That evening, Manny's departure left Johanna uneasy. She knew rumors about her harboring an Apache warrior would swirl among the settlers. Some would see her compassion as a betrayal. Others might spin tales that she was forced to help or that she had joined forces with the Apaches. The truth was simpler. She couldn't let a man die of thirst at her doorstep. But the frontier had a way of warping truths into dangerous shapes. Later, a traveling peddler named Tobias Wells came by with his mule cart loaded with tin pans, cloth, and other sundries. He was talkative, full of gossip he picked up from the ranches in the outskirts of Fort Bowie. "Johanna, you wouldn't believe the chatter," he said, unrolling a bolt of calico on her porch. "There's talk of an Apache war party camping near the mesa and a homesteader who's gone plumb loco offering them help." She feigned ignorance. "Sounds dangerous. Any idea who they're talking about?" Tobias shrugged. "Not sure. But Manny Alvarez said something about a neighbor of his who's... Well, let's just say Manny's worried for her safety." Johanna's heart lurched, but she kept her face composed. "That's a shame," she replied. "Maybe folks should keep a closer eye on actual troublemakers, not the kindly souls." Tobias nodded amiably, though a curious glint remained in his eyes. He let the topic drop for the moment, but Johanna had no doubt he'd carry more rumors wherever he went next. Each new visitor seemed to bring fresh tension, and though the immediate danger from the Apache war party had passed, the repercussions of her deed were only beginning. A week after her brush with the Apache warriors, Johanna found an unexpected guest. Sheriff William Langley, newly installed in the nearby settlement of Sierra Bend. A wiry man with a perpetual squint, Sheriff Langley was known for his unwavering stance on law and order, especially where the Apaches were concerned. Johanna had met him once in passing when she went to buy feed. He'd struck her as stern but fair, the type who took pride in wearing the badge. He rode up in the late morning, his horse's hooves stirring up a swirl of dust. Johanna had just finished tending her vegetable patch and greeted him with a cautious nod. "Sheriff, what brings you out this far?" He dismounted, leading his horse by the reins. "Got wind of some tensions," he said, his tone careful. "Heard from Manny Alvarez that a war party was seen around your place." Johanna forced a steady voice. "They came and went, yes." The sheriff studied her eyes, narrowed. "Why would they gather here? You see anything suspicious?" She took a breath, counting the risks of telling the whole truth, but deception might only deepen suspicion. "I found a wounded Apache near my well, gave him water. He was close to death. The war party came the next morning to reclaim him." Langley's face hardened. "You helped an Apache warrior?" "I helped a wounded man," Johanna said, raising her chin. "He was dying of thirst. I couldn't just let him perish." The sheriff nodded slowly, but tension rippled in his jaw. "I understand compassion, ma'am, but these are dangerous times. The Apaches have been raiding ranches, attacking stagecoaches. If word spreads that you're sympathetic, some folks might not take kindly to that." Johanna's cheeks flamed. "Let them think what they want. I won't apologize for saving a life." A flicker of respect seemed to cross Langley's face. "I don't fault your heart, Ms. Russell. Just want you to be aware cavalry might come sniffing around, asking questions about whether you're siding with them. I'd advise caution." She nodded, swallowing. "Thank you for the warning." Langley tipped his hat, taking his leave, but before he mounted up, he paused. "Also heard rumor that a band of Apaches is still roaming the nearby canyons. If you see anything, come into Sierra Bend and report it, or send word. We aim to keep everyone safe." Johanna thanked him, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. As he rode off, she recognized the subtle threat in his caution. The frontier was a tinderbox. Her act of mercy might be interpreted as a spark that could lead to a wildfire of suspicion. She prayed it wouldn't come to that. Days turned into a fortnight with no further sightings of the Apache war party. Johanna took each sunrise with careful optimism, rising early to tend chores, scanning the horizon for trouble. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that eyes remained on her, watching from just beyond the cactus line. One late afternoon, Johanna saddled her mare Daisy, intending to collect wild herbs near a small stream that fed into the Rio Bonito. She needed fresh rosemary and yarrow to keep her medicinal pantry stocked. If another wounded visitor arrived, she'd rather be prepared. The day was brutally hot, so she waited until the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the desert floor. She rode at a measured pace, scanning the cactus-studded land. After half an hour, she reached the stream, a narrow trickle flanked by hardy shrubs and sparse cottonwoods. Dismounting, she led Daisy to drink, while she knelt among the stones, searching for yarrow's feathery leaves. The murmur of water soothed her, and for a moment she forgot about the tension swirling around her homestead. That's when she noticed them footprints. Several sets pressed deep into the muddy edge of the stream, a cluster of them too large to be dainty ranch hand boots, too smooth to be typical cowboy footwear. Johanna's heart quickened as she bent to examine them. Moccasins, she guessed, Apache footprints, and they seemed fresh, no more than a day old. Adrenaline flared. She glanced around, half expecting to see watchers peering from behind rocks. The footprints were scattered, but she recognized the pattern, a small group moving along the stream. Perhaps they had watered their horses here. Had they come this close to her land again, or was this part of their usual territory? Fear and curiosity swirled in Johanna's chest. She recalled the wounded warrior's face. He was hardly more than a boy carried off by men who might be grateful or vengeful. She couldn't tell, but clearly the Apaches were still active around these parts. She gently brushed her fingers over one of the prints, half an inch of dried mud crumbling at her touch. Once again, she found herself at the intersection of empathy and caution. She had no desire for further conflict, yet she couldn't deny the sense of connection. These were people trying to survive the same harsh land she was, though the world called them enemies. Suddenly, Daisy whinnied, startling Johanna. She sprang up, scanning the horizon. Nothing. Yet the horse's ears were pricked, her nostrils flaring. Johanna felt her own pulse racing. Whether it was an animal lurking or an Apache scout, she decided not to linger. She quickly gathered a handful of the herbs she needed, mounted Daisy, and rode back home with her nerves taut as bowstrings. That night, sleep eluded her. The footprints reminded her that peace here was tenuous at best. True to the sheriff's warning, soldiers from Fort Bowie arrived the following week, 2 cavalrymen in dusty uniforms, led by a Lieutenant Caswell, a burly officer with a square jaw and a suspicious glare. They approached Johanna's homestead at midday, carrying an air of authority. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Caswell said after dismounting, "we've had reports of Apache activity in this region. We're verifying any possible contact between locals and hostiles." Johanna forced a calm demeanor. "I've seen them pass through, yes. They came for a wounded man who was lying near my property." Caswell gave a curt nod. "You aided an enemy combatant from what we hear." "I helped a man who was dying," Johanna replied. Her tone was steady, though her heart thudded. The lieutenant's gaze flicked around her property, noting the well, the modest cabin, the meager farmland. "Have they threatened you or demanded anything? Has there been any sign they plan to attack?" She shook her head. "No, they left peacefully." Caswell pursed his lips. "Perhaps they'll return, or perhaps they're planning a larger movement. We'll station a small patrol near the main trail for a few days. If you see anything suspicious, you must report it immediately." Johanna couldn't help but notice the implied pressure. "Understood." Before leaving, one of the cavalrymen remarked in passing, "Be careful with your kindness, ma'am. These savages might twist it against you." Johanna bit her tongue, refusing to rise to the insult. The Apaches had not proven savage in her single encounter. If anything, they left her property without harm. But she also knew that the cavalry was set in their view, shaped by years of conflict and bloodshed. As the soldiers rode off, Johanna realized the fine line she was treading. Both sides, the Apaches and the U.S. Army, had eyes on her. Should another wounded warrior show up, or if the Apaches decided to thank her, or if a neighbor misunderstood her intentions, the consequences could spiral out of control. The following week, Manny Alvarez visited again, bringing a side of salted beef. "Heard you don't have much meat left," he said, offering a friendly grin. She thanked him, touched by the gesture. Despite the swirling rumors, Manny still seemed genuine in his desire to help. They talked on the porch, sharing small talk about the weather livestock and the challenges of desert living. Eventually, Manny's face grew somber. "A few folks in Sierra Bend lost cattle last night," he said quietly. "Tracks suggest it was Apaches. The herd was driven off." Johanna's stomach sank. "Have they come to blame me for that too?" Manny shook his head. "No. But folks are spooked. Some are saying all Apaches are in league no matter what. They're forming a volunteer militia to guard the settlement. Just be prepared if something sparks a bigger confrontation. They might come this way suspecting you've given them safe haven." Johanna stared at the horizon. The day was bright, but her thoughts were dark. The cattle theft would only inflame tensions. Her act of kindness might be overshadowed by these new raids fueling fear and hatred. She tried not to let despair settle in. "Thank you for warning me," she said. Manny gave a sympathetic nod. "You're a good woman, Johanna. Don't let the talk get you down. The desert has a way of punishing pride and rewarding humility. Maybe in time, folks will see that." She appreciated his words, though she wondered if they rang hollow in the current climate. That evening, the wind blew fierce across the desert, carrying the scent of dust and uncertainty. Johanna lay awake, listening to the moan of the wind against the shutters, hearing the distant echo of howls, coyotes, or perhaps the ghosts of old battles. She felt caught in a storm that was gathering, swirling around her, despite her best intentions. In the days that followed, Johanna went about her life under the watchful gaze of suspicion. A small patrol of cavalrymen occasionally passed by, scanning the horizon, sometimes exchanging curt greetings with her. Neighbors visited less often, and when they did, conversations were polite, but guarded. She felt the isolation wearing on her spirit. Yet one afternoon, as she was mending her fence along the southern perimeter, she spotted something unusual. Tucked beneath a cluster of rocks was a small pouch made of dyed leather and decorated with beads, a pattern reminiscent of Apache craftsmanship. Heart pounding, she carefully lifted it, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. Inside the pouch, she found a chunk of turquoise, a small polished stone that glowed a deep blue-green under the sun. Accompanying it was a single eagle feather. Johanna's breath caught. She knew enough from passing stories that turquoise held significance for many native tribes, symbolizing protection, luck, and even gratitude. The eagle feather also carried deep cultural meaning. This felt like a gift, or a token of thanks, possibly, from the wounded warrior she'd helped or one of his kin. Tears pricked her eyes. So they hadn't forgotten. She carefully rewrapped the items, uncertain whether to keep them hidden or place them somewhere meaningful. The gift was a reminder that she wasn't alone in her compassion, that at least someone among the Apache recognized her kindness. Yet at the same time, if anyone else discovered this gift, it might fan more suspicion. People would say she was consorting with the enemy. After deliberating, she decided to keep the pouch safe in her cabin. She hid it in a small wooden trunk by her bed, along with personal mementos of her late husband. She whispered a quiet thank you to the open air, unsure if the giver was near enough to hear. That night, she slept a little easier, buoyed by the knowledge that kindness could cross boundaries in ways that fear and hatred could not. Late summer brought scorching temperatures that cracked the ground and wilted crops. Johanna rationed her water carefully, praying for a monsoon that never came. The atmosphere was as tense as the land, with each day bringing fresh rumors of raids and cavalry maneuvers. The volunteer militia in Sierra Bend drilled under the watchful eye of Sheriff Langley, who worried about the possibility of an Apache assault on the settlement. Despite the simmering tensions, Johanna's life continued in quiet determination until one afternoon changed everything once again. She was in her cornfield, attempting to salvage what little remained of her withered stalks, when she heard distant gunfire. The cracks echoed off the rocky foothills. Alarmed, she climbed a small rise behind her house, shading her eyes as she scanned the horizon. Far off, near the direction of Manny Alvarez's ranch, a plume of dust rose, accompanied by the faint echo of shouts, or perhaps yells. Johanna's stomach knotted. Had the Apaches attacked Manny's ranch? Or was it a clash between the cavalry and some renegade band? Unsure of what else to do, Johanna saddled Daisy and rode cautiously in that direction. She kept a wide berth circling around hills and using the natural cover of boulders. The gunfire died down, replaced by an eerie stillness. Eventually, she spotted a small canyon opening where bullet echoes might have been amplified. Dismounting, she led Daisy forward, rifle in hand. Adrenaline thundered through her. What if she stumbled upon a firefight? Should she turn back? The memory of Manny's kindness urged her onward. She had to check if he was safe. As she approached the canyon's mouth, she saw a horrifying sight. Manny Alvarez's wagon overturned. A horse lay dead, shot through the flank. Manny himself was sprawled on the ground, clutching his leg. Blood soaked his pants. Johanna rushed to him, scanning the surroundings for immediate danger. No one else seemed to be there. Whoever had done this was gone. "Manny," she hissed, kneeling beside him. "What happened?" He winced, teeth clenched in agony. "Ambush. Apache, or at least I think. They were wearing war paint, but they rode off. Must have thought I was dead." He groaned, pain contorting his features. Johanna's heart raced. He was losing blood, quickly. She tore a strip of cloth from her apron, pressing it hard to the wound. "Stay still. I'll try to stop the bleeding." He trembled, eyes glazed. "Johanna, you shouldn't be here. They might still be around. I can't leave you to die." She snapped, focusing on the makeshift tourniquet. Her hands shook, but she pressed down firmly, recalling the same first aid steps her mother had taught her long ago. Manny's breathing was ragged. "Why would they do this?" he muttered. "Took my horse. Shot me. I never harmed them." Johanna's mind whirled. She thought of the wounded Apache she'd saved, and the gift she'd found a sign of gratitude. Yet here Manny was, shot by men in war paint. Was it a different band or some renegade group? She felt a surge of anger. This violence undermined any chance of peace. Still, Manny was her friend. She had to help him survive. With effort, she hoisted Manny to his feet and steadied him against Daisy. "We're getting you home," she said. "Hold on." Every step was a struggle. Manny's agonized breathing stung her ears, and she prayed they wouldn't run into more trouble. But they made slow progress. Finally, near sundown, they reached her cabin. She half-dragged Manny inside, laying him on her cot. He was delirious, drifting in and out of consciousness, the pain evident on his sweat-beaded face. Johanna spent the night tending to him, cleaning his wound, applying a poultice of crushed herbs to stave off infection. She boiled strips of cloth for bandages. As darkness deepened, Manny's fever rose, and he raved about horses and ghosts. She feared he might not make it till morning. At some point in the night, Manny's eyes flew open. He grabbed Johanna's wrist, voice strained. They wore paint like Apaches, he rasped, but something was off. Didn't understand their shouts. Strange accent. Could be outlaws posing as Apaches. I can't be sure. Then he sank back into feverish sleep. Johanna's mind churned with the revelation. Outlaws disguising themselves as Apaches. Why would they do that? To incite more hatred, to disguise their own banditry, or to push the army and the Apaches toward a bigger conflict? Whatever the reason, Manny's story could change everything if he survived to tell it. By dawn, Manny's fever had lessened, though he was too weak to stand. Johanna gave him water, urging him to rest. She needed a doctor for him, but the nearest one was in Sierra Bend, and Manny couldn't be moved that far without risking further injury. Johanna considered riding for help, but she hesitated, worried that Manny might die if left alone. Mid-morning brought unexpected visitors. Johanna heard horses outside and tensed, fearing another attack. Grabbing her rifle, she peered through a crack in the door. Sheriff Langley and 2 militia volunteers stood there, scanning the yard. Johanna recognized the volunteers as local ranch hands who'd joined the anti-Apache patrol. She opened the door a crack. Sheriff Manny's inside. He's hurt bad. Langley strode in, eyes widening at the sight of Manny's prone form. What happened? Quickly. Johanna explained about the ambush in the canyon. Manny, half conscious, managed to croak out a few words. Not sure they were Apache. Possible outlaws. The sheriff's brow furrowed. Outlaws in war paint. Johanna nodded. He heard them shouting in a strange accent, not in the Apache language. One of the militiamen, Hank Wilcox, spat in disgust. Likely Apaches playing mind games. Manny shook his head weakly. No. Different. From any Apaches I've heard before. Sheriff Langley knelt beside Manny, checking the wound. We'll get you a wagon to Sierra Bend, Manny. Hang in there. He glanced at Johanna, eyes flicking with concern. And something else, perhaps relief, that Manny's predicament had overshadowed the rumors about her. I'll send for Doc Hawthorne. She nodded, heart pounding with both fear for Manny and curiosity about the truth. If outlaws were posing as Apaches that could be behind the recent spate of raids and killings that everyone blamed on the tribes, would the sheriff pursue that angle or stick to the simpler narrative? True to his word, the sheriff summoned a wagon from Sierra Bend. By late afternoon, Manny was carefully loaded on a makeshift stretcher. Johanna rode alongside, determined to help however she could. The journey took hours, each bump eliciting a groan from Manny. Sunset painted the sky in fiery hues as they approached the dusty main street of Sierra Bend. Doc Hawthorne, a gruff older man with wire-rimmed glasses, met them outside his small clinic. He ushered Manny inside, barking instructions to Johanna and the sheriff. As they worked to stabilize Manny, Johanna's thoughts churned. Who was behind the ambush, and how would the town react if the truth emerged? News of Manny's ambush spread through Sierra Bend faster than wildfire. By the next day, saloon patrons at the Silver Spur and the local mercantile were abuzz with speculation. Some claimed Manny's accounts were mere delirious ramblings, that he'd been attacked by Apaches in war paint, no question. Others whispered that maybe a band of outlaws had found a cunning way to instigate war. The tension was palpable. Sheriff Langley tried to keep order. He interviewed Manny as soon as the man regained enough strength to speak coherently. Johanna stayed near Manny's bedside, offering water and moral support. Manny recounted the encounter, detail by detail, the sudden gunfire, the strange voices. the fleeting glimpse of men whose war paint was clumsily applied, almost theatrical. As Manny spoke, Johanna noticed the sheriff's thoughtful expression. Could it be the sheriff himself suspected a bigger conspiracy? Outside, the volunteer militia ramped up their patrols, scouring the desert for any sign of Apache. Some doubted Manny's story, calling him a traitor or a fool. Still others began to suspect that the wave of cattle thefts and raids weren't Apache work at all, but the cunning strategy of a band of thieves. Johanna found a small glimmer of hope in that shift of suspicion. Maybe this new perspective would spare the Apaches from further violence. Yet she also feared that if the truth didn't come out, the tension would only escalate into a full-blown conflict. As Manny drifted to sleep, Johanna stepped outside to breathe. Sierra Bend was a modest settlement, a few dozen buildings lining a single dusty road, with the saloon, church, and mercantile forming the central hubs of daily life. She gazed at the sloping hills beyond, imagining the networks of canyons and hidden trails where outlaws might hide waiting to strike again. A group of townsfolk stood on the corner, their voices urgent. She caught snippets. "We can't just stand by. The Apaches are plotting. Manny's story is hogwash. We need the cavalry." Her spirit sank. Misinformation was a mighty force, fueled by fear and ignorance. She wondered if she should speak up, share her own experiences, or mention the gift of turquoise and the eagle feather. But who would believe her? She returned to the clinic, finding the sheriff resting against a wall, arms crossed. He eyed her. "I heard you helped Manny. Risked your own neck." "I won't forget that, Miss Russell." Johanna gave a weary nod. "I do what I can." He sighed. "Manny's story complicates matters. If outlaws are trying to pin blame on the Apaches, we have a bigger mess than we thought." Catching her breath, Johanna asked, "What will you do?" Langley's stare hardened with determination. "Find them. We can't let this escalate into a war. There's already a cavalry detachment heading this way. If they think the Apaches are behind all this, they'll go hunting them down. I'd like to avoid that if the Apaches are truly innocent." Johanna's heart rose, though she knew the next steps would be fraught with danger. A plan took shape the next day. Sheriff Langley assembled a small posse Johanna insisted on joining, much to his initial reluctance. "You sure about this, Ms. Russell? It's dangerous, and we don't know what we'll find." She stood firm, gripping her old rifle. "I've seen enough out there. I've dealt with Apaches. I want to help. Manny's my friend, and I can't stand by if outlaws are behind this." Relenting Langley allowed her to come along with 3 other volunteers men Johanna recognized from ranches further south. They set out at dawn, heading toward the canyon where Manny was ambushed, hoping to pick up the trail of the fake war party. Dust rose behind their horses as they rode in tense silence, scanning the terrain for any sign of movement. By midday, they reached the canyon. The sheriff and the volunteers spread out, examining wagon tracks, footprints, and any clues left behind. Johanna's nerves jingled. She recalled Manny's account of gunfire and the strange voices. Every rustle of brush set her on edge, imagining a hidden rifle aimed at her head. Hank Wilcox, one of the volunteers, grunted as he knelt beside some tracks. "Looks like a group of 5 or 6 horses. Hard to tell, though. Sand's pretty loose here." Langley examined the ground. "We'll follow them as far as we can." He noted the direction, leading the posse deeper into the rugged foothills. The trail wound through narrow passes, the walls towering overhead oppressive in their silence. Hours passed. The sun beat down mercilessly, and water was precious. Johanna's throat felt parched, but she forced herself to keep going. An uneasy hush settled over the group. They all feared an ambush. Eventually they discovered what appeared to be a small campsite nestled against the base of a cliff ash. From a fire, scattered footprints, a few broken crates. On closer inspection, they found whiskey bottles labeled from a distillery in El Paso. Johanna's heart pounded. This looked more like a bandit hideout than an Apache encampment. Apaches rarely left so many signs, nor did they typically carry commercially labeled whiskey bottles. Sheriff Langley picked up a scrap of cloth from the ground. The pattern seemed to be part of a stolen uniform, or maybe an old cavalry jacket. Next to it, a tattered piece of rawhide with some smeared paint. Johanna felt a rush of vindication. It seemed these men had indeed disguised themselves as Apaches. But where were they now? A quick search revealed footprints leading further up a steep path. The posse followed quietly, hearts thudding. They rounded a bend, rifles at the ready, anticipating a firefight. Suddenly, shots rang out. Bullets pinged off rocks near Johanna's horse. The animal reared, nearly throwing her. She clung to the reins, fear gripping her like a vice. Sheriff Langley shouted for everyone to take cover. They dismounted, diving behind boulders. A standoff began. Hidden in the rocks above the outlaws rained sporadic gunfire, their muzzle flashes betraying their positions. The posse returned fire, but the vantage point favored the ambushers. Johanna's hands trembled on her rifle. She had only 3 bullets, something she'd never had a chance to replenish, and each shot needed to count. Langley crawled over to her, breathing hard. "We need to flush them out or we're sitting ducks." Johanna nodded. Adrenaline roared in her ears as she recalled Manny's condition, the injustice of these criminals, hiding behind an Apache disguise, fueling hate. She steadied her rifle on a rock ledge, sighting a man who popped up to fire. She squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and the man toppled behind a boulder, cursing. Whether he was wounded or just hit the dirt, she couldn't tell. The volunteers fanned out. Hank Wilcox managed to flank the outlaws on one side, exchanging close shots among the crags. Johanna heard a man scream. She wasn't sure if it was one of the posse or an outlaw. The gunpowder smell filled her nostrils, and fear threatened to paralyze her. She grit her teeth, fired another shot. A muzzle flash flickered above, followed by a loud crack. A bullet whizzed past Johanna's ear, close enough to ruffle her hair. Her heart hammered. She had 1 bullet left. Amid the chaos, a thunderous yell echoed through the canyon. Another volley of shots rang out, but these sounded different, less smoky. Johanna glanced over her shoulder. A small group of men appeared on horseback at the canyon's entrance. For a sickening moment, she feared another band of outlaws was upon them. But then she recognized the patchwork of attire and realized they were Apache warriors, perhaps the same band who'd once surrounded her homestead. At their head was the tall, silver-haired leader she had encountered that fateful morning. The outlaws pinned between the posse and the Apaches panicked. Their shots wavered, and the Apache warriors capitalized on the confusion. They dismounted and rushed forward in a coordinated attack. Johanna stared in shock. She never expected to see Apaches coming to their aid. But was that truly their intention? Or were they just attacking outlaws who had stolen from them? Either way, the outlaws were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Within minutes, the skirmish ended. 2 outlaws lay wounded, 3 more dead or captured. 1 volunteer was grazed by a bullet, but nothing fatal. Sheriff Langley, panting, emerged from cover. Johanna slowly rose, her ears still ringing from gunfire. The tall Apache leader stood a short distance away, locking eyes with her. A fleeting moment of recognition passed between them. Then he turned to the outlaws, uttering something in his language. The wounded criminals cowered wide-eyed, their disguises now fully exposed. Their war paint was smeared from sweat, some still wearing tattered cavalry garb or patched-up clothes. Langley lifted his rifle warily, not sure how to handle the Apaches. But Johanna stepped forward, raising her hands. Heart pounding, she looked at the silver-haired man and spoke softly. "Thank you." She wasn't sure if he understood. But after a moment, he inclined his head. It was then that another Apache warrior approached one Johanna recognized instantly. The young man she'd given water to. He had a faint scar on his side where the bullet had grazed him. He said something to his leader, nodding in Johanna's direction. The older man regarded her again, then stepped aside, letting the posse approach the captured outlaws. Sheriff Langley, swallowing, spoke in measured tones. "We'll take these men to Fort Bowie. They're criminals." He gestured to the outlaws, who glared in defeat. Another volunteer quickly disarmed them. Johanna could hardly believe the turn of events. Apaches and the sheriff's posse facing off the same threat. She sensed a mutual understanding forming in the dusty canyon air, that these outlaws had tried to frame the Apaches, fueling the cycle of violence. For a moment, the desert seemed to hold its breath, acknowledging a fragile alliance. The silver-haired leader beckoned the younger warrior to mount up. They turned to leave, but the young warrior paused, meeting Johanna's gaze with something akin to gratitude. Then he lifted his hand in a small, respectful salute before spurring his horse away. The group of warriors disappeared among the crags as silently as they'd arrived. Sheriff Langley exhaled as if releasing a great burden. "I never thought I'd see the day." Johanna lowered her rifle. "Perhaps there's hope for peace after all," she whispered, though she knew the journey would be long. The posse escorted the wounded outlaws back to Sierra Bend, where the truth soon roared through the town like a stampede. These men had orchestrated raids, cattle thefts, and ambushes, disguising themselves as Apaches to stoke fear and deflect blame. Their motives ranged from robbery to inciting the settlers into a larger conflict, hoping the chaos would allow them to operate freely. When Manny Alvarez learned of the arrests, he offered a weary smile. "So my ramblings weren't the fever speaking," he muttered. He was recovering well thanks to Johanna's care. Still, not everyone was quick to accept that the Apaches were innocent in these recent attacks. Old grudges die hard, and the Apaches had certainly fought their share of battles. Yet the presence of tangible proof, the outlaws' confessions, the disguised gear, shifted the conversation in town. Sheriff Langley assured the local ranchers that the immediate threat of raids was quelled. The cavalry detachment from Fort Bowie arrived days later and took custody of the criminals, verifying the scheme themselves. In the midst of the shifting tides, Johanna found herself the object of renewed interest. Some townsfolk apologized for their earlier suspicions. Others still cast sideways glances, uncertain if they could trust her closeness to the Apache cause. A few, however, praised her bravery, acknowledging that her act of mercy had in a roundabout way led to a surprising alliance and the unmasking of a criminal band. One evening, Manny, still on crutches, hobbled up to Johanna outside the clinic. "Guess you're a hero in your own way," he teased, though his eyes shone with gratitude. "If you hadn't helped that wounded warrior, we'd all still be in the dark." Johanna blushed at the praise. "I was just trying to do what's right. Nobody deserves to die alone in the desert." He squeezed her hand gently. "You saved me, too. I don't forget that." With the crisis resolved, at least for the moment, Johanna chose to return to her homestead. Manny, though still weak, insisted he would be fine in the care of Doc Hawthorne and the townspeople. Sheriff Langley expressed cautious optimism about the future. The Apaches know we're not all blind to the truth, he said. Maybe that'll ease tensions a bit. Johanna rode back across the desert, the sun descending in a blaze of orange. The memory of the canyon skirmish lingered in her mind. The thunder of gunfire, the arrival of the Apache warriors, and the final moment of silent understanding between her and the young man she'd helped. She realized that in another time, in another war, they might have been lifelong enemies. But a single act of compassion had cut through the veil of mistrust. Reaching her property at dusk, Johanna's heart soared at the sight of her humble cabin, her well, her animals. Though the desert could be harsh, it was still home. She fed her chickens, gathered eggs, and gave Daisy a grateful pat before stabling her. Then in the quiet of her cabin, she retrieved the small beaded pouch from its hiding place. She held the turquoise stone and eagle feather in her hands, feeling tears of relief slip down her cheeks. Softly she murmured words into the gathering night. Thanks to the wounded warrior, to the silver-haired leader, to Manny and the sheriff, and to the desert itself, a land that tested her bravery, compassion and resilience at every turn. She set the pouch on her windowsill, letting the moonlight illuminate the beads. Tomorrow the sun would rise on a new day, one in which she'd keep living by the principles that guided her to tend the land, to respect her neighbors, no matter who they were, and to give water to the thirsty, even when fear demanded otherwise. Thank you for listening to She Gave Water to a Wounded Apache. The next morning, warriors surrounded her home. If you found yourself on the edge of your seat, heart pounding with each twist and turn, then this story has served its purpose to remind us that acts of compassion can bridge even the deepest divides. Johanna's courage shows that one person with one simple gesture can change everything. Before you go, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. By doing so, you help spread stories that celebrate bravery, empathy, and hope. Plus, you'll never miss out on the next thrilling tale from the Old West and beyond. Let's keep alive the spirit of storytelling that brings us together, one story at a time. Go ahead and show your support now, and stay tuned for even more adventures.